What is the libertarian position on the minimum wage? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again for another round of Libertarian Angle.
Good to see you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. If you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org for 34 years of principal arguments on libertarianism. So, Richard, I came across an article on a leftist website called Common Dreams, in which the leftists are lamenting the fact that the federal minimum wage is still at $7.25 an hour. It was set there in 2009, according to the article. This kind of surprised me. I didn't know that the federal minimum wage had not been raised since then. I know that certain states have raised their state minimum wage, maybe even to $15 an hour or higher. And so it seemed to me that maybe this is good news. The fact that they have not raised the minimum wage, you would seem to indicate that maybe we've been making progress. I mean, you and I have been raising this issue for really the whole 34 years that FFF has been in existence. You came on board in the very beginning of FFF as vice president of academic affairs. You'll recall that over the years, we have addressed the minimum wage several times, many times. And what's amazing to me is that the issue still has to be discussed and still has to be debated. I mean, it's almost like there's this mental block among leftists, as well as conservatives who have certainly not done anything to abolish the minimum wage. They just cannot understand sound reasoning. They have this notion that all a nation has to do is raise the state mandated minimum wage and voila, all the workers are raised out of poverty. I mean, if that were the case, then isn't that all that the dictators in North Korea and Cuba and Venezuela and other nations have to do to lift their people out of poverty? Just mandate a minimum wage of $15 an hour, or better yet, $100 an hour. Why don't the leftists ever raise the minimum wage to $100 an hour, Richard? Is it, or maybe $1,000 an hour? I mean, is it that they're so scared of the fact that poor people might become millionaires and then they'd have to start condemning them as part of the rich? Is that why they don't raise the minimum wage to $1,000 an hour? Well, you know, I've got a better idea, and I've blogged on this earlier in the week. Let's just abolish the minimum wage. I mean, it should never have been enacted in the first place. The Supreme Court came close to permanently declaring it unconstitutional. It certainly is a deprivation of liberty. Why shouldn't people be free to contract on any wage they want to? I mean, when we talk about free markets, aren't we talking about markets that are free of this type of government intervention, where people are free to negotiate their own wage rates? And really, one of the biggest problems with the minimum wage is not only its violation of the principles of liberty, of economic liberty, but it puts people out of work. That workers subjectively, employers subjectively determine the value of a person's labor. Like it or not, that's just the way things work. If employers subjectively feels that a worker's work is less than the state mandated minimum, he's going to go unemployed. Because the minimum wage doesn't require employers to hire workers. It says if you hire them, you have to pay this wage. So if an employer says, well, I think that person's labor is worth $5 an hour, and I'll hire him at $5, and the state mandated minimum is $7.25, that person goes unemployed. And what just boggles my mind that leftists cannot understand that principle, that really what they're doing in the name of helping the poor is really attacking the poor, because they're depriving the poor, those poor people whose labor is valued at less than the state mandated minimum. They're consigning them to a life of unemployment and, of course, welfare, or going into the drug trade and the like. So I say we got to keep addressing this issue, like it or not, but maybe we're making progress, and ultimately we'll get this thing abolished, and maybe at some point people will stop advocating its restoration and its raising. What do you think, Richard?
Well, I think, your point about it seems to be an unending battle has been from the start. I first met the famous free market journalist Henry Hazlitt at an Austrian economic conference back in June 1974. And I had been reading him since a teenager. I had dug up all of his books, as well as a lot of his old articles going back to the 1930s. And when I was first talking to him, having this opportunity to meet one of my favorite free market thinkers, I said, I noticed when I went back and saw some of your articles from the 1930s, actually in the Nation magazine, you were already attacking the minimum wage for being like 25 cents an hour or something back then. And here you are in the 1970s, still arguing against a minimum wage of whatever it was at that time. And he said, yes, it seems to be like a never-ending battle to get this common sense logic through that you were alluding to. And I think that what seems not to be understood is that the businessman has no revenues out of which he can pay salaries to those he hires, other than that which he earns from selling products to the consumers. He cannot afford to pay for the capital machinery, for the renting or the purchase of land, for the maintenance of his machinery, or the paying of wages, more than what he anticipates to be able to earn from selling the product. It's the consumers who decide what they think the product is worth, and therefore how much they might be willing to buy at a certain price. And if you multiply the per unit price by the number of units you sell, that's what is the businessman's revenue. And he can't afford to pay more for resources and inputs, including labor, than the revenue he anticipates he may earn. And therefore, he cannot afford in his own mind to pay a worker more than what he thinks that work is going to contribute to the making of a valuable and saleable product in the marketplace. Now, at this point, usually it is said, yes, your businessman, he will subjectively think the worker is worth 22 cents and he'll starve that worker. But what is forgotten is that we operate in competitive markets. And just as workers are competing for jobs, employers are competing for workers. And the businessman who says, gee, if I could only get that worker who I value at $5 an hour to work for 22 cents, think of all the money I'll make off him. But his very skills means that he has employability in other sectors of the economy. And if there's another businessman who says, I think he's worth $1, and this guy is trying to get by paying him only 22 cents an hour, I'm going to offer him $1. And that worker will shift there. And then the first employer has to say, well, I really think he's worth $5, and that guy is stealing him away for $1. I better offer $1.50. But then another employer says, $1.50, I think this guy is worth $2. And slowly but surely, the wage is bid up among competing employers for the valuable skills of the worker, even valuable low skills, to what cumulatively businessmen in the economy think that worker is worth in alternative lines of production for which he could be employed. So to use the jargon of the economist, the worker tends to be moving towards receiving what is the marginal value of his product. That is, if I don't hire him, how much output would I lose having the chance to manufacture and be able to sell to consumers at a particular price? And therefore, the workers get the real value of what their hire is worth. There seems to be lost in this. Now, this idea of not understanding how prices work and the two-sidedness competition, or how a higher wage can dissuade employers from hiring people, a lower wage can make it more attractive for them to hire people. There's sort of a schizophrenia, because these same people, progressives, leftists, socialists, however you want to label them, they understand this in other contexts. And what context, Jacob? Oh, smoking is bad. We have to dissuade people from smoking. Let's raise the tax on a pack of cigarettes. Because the higher you raise the price of cigarettes, fewer cigarettes people are going to buy, even if they really like to smoke. Or, oh, fossil fuels are bad for the environment. How do we get people to drive less or to economize on how many gallons they consume? Raise the tax per gallon of gas. They'll buy less gasoline. So you see, this is schizophrenia. They understand this in certain contexts, syntaxes. We don't want them to drink. We don't want them to smoke. We don't want them to be, burning fossil fuels. But when it applies to this labor market, they seem to have a blind spot to understand the same logic applies. The higher you mandate the wage, the more certain employers are going to say, at the margin, he's not worth it. He was worth hiring at $5, but not $5.50. He was worth hiring at $7, but not $7.25. He was worth hiring at $14.50, but now if Seattle or Los Angeles or some other places imposed a municipal minimum wage, he's not worth $15 an hour. I'll be losing more than I'm able to get from having him working for me. Now, how do you raise wages if you're concerned about the poor? Well, one way is education, improve the skills and therefore the value of the worker. The other way to do this is invest in more and better capital. A man who's able to produce 100 bushels of wheat in an hour with the accompanying machinery with which he does the harvesting is going to be more valuable to an employer than the worker who has less sophisticated machinery and only can harvest 50 bushels in an hour. So more capital, more productive capital, and improving the human labor skills. Now, human labor skills has to do with education. Now, and knowing we were going to discuss this today, Jacob, if I may continue for a minute or two more. Every month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics releases a report called the employment situation. The August report will come out soon, but the latest one is from July 7th, telling us what was the employment situation in the United States in June. And what we can say is that, again, this is the government making these calculations. Overall unemployment for everyone in the workforce was 3.6% of the labor force. That's fairly low. Now, what's interesting, however, which is why I'm bringing this up, what if we break this down by different racial groups? What about whites? Whites in general had an unemployment rate of 3.1% of the labor force, as measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. For blacks, remember, 3.1 for whites. For blacks, 6%. In other words, double the unemployment of white people. Now let's look at youth, right? Youth have less experience, less on-the-job training, maybe not have finished high school or dropped out of high school. Therefore, their skill level is relatively low. Youth unemployment in general. Remember, overall employment for everybody is 3.6. Youth unemployment, that is 16 years to 19 years of age, 9.7, 3 times higher than the overall national average. Black youth unemployment, 16 to 19 years of age, 15.6%, while white youth unemployment, 16 to 19 years of age, is only 9.7%, noticeably less, almost half the amount of black youth unemployment, but both of which are much higher than the national average. Now, in comparison, it's interesting, Asian unemployment, right? Asian Americans, 3.2%. Now, how is this all relevant? The fact is that we live in a society of government-run education. Yes, there's private schools, there's some people who homeschool, there's the attempt to have these charter and choice schools, but basically you have an educational system that is dominated by government-run education from the kindergarten through graduating high school. And it is notorious that the government-run, the socialist schools in inner cities, in minority areas, in ethnic communities, is in general, on average, abysmally less well qualifying and training and educating and arousing enthusiasm than in, again, as a brushstroke generalization, many other communities, including Asian and white communities. So here we have a situation in which too many Blacks and Hispanics are suffering from unbelievably poor education at the hands of the state. Then they enter the workforce either before or after graduating high school. And with this poor training imposed upon them by mandatory attendance at taxpayers' expense, with teachers' unions that have their own agendas, having little to do with trying to really educate people in a monopoly government-run situation, they're now thrown into the market where employers are going to say, it's not per se that they're Black. It's not per se that they're Hispanic. Are there race-minded people in society? Of course. There were stupid people 1,000 years ago. There are stupid people today. And if we haven't blown ourselves off the planet, there'll be stupid people 1,000 years from now. But in general, in our society today, it is not a racialist prejudice. It's saying this person has gone to a bad high school or has dropped out of a high school. And look at his skill set relative to hiring someone who has graduated and had a better education, or has had a better initial work experience, or has seemingly more enthusiasm, having been aroused in some degree of interest in learning and improving themselves compared to those inner city schools. So now you say that someone who is less attractive in general because of their skill set to be employed by an employer, and you're saying this guy has to be paid $7.25, when, to be honest, he's only worth $4 or $5. Or you're telling me I have to pay him $15? You've got to be joking. His value to me is barely the $7.25. So in combination with a failed government education system that is particularly given the short end of the stick to too many members of ethnic and racial minority communities in the United States, on top of then setting a minimum wage at which the employer is legally allowed to hire them, you've created a disaster, a fiasco, a tragedy for too many people who will never be able to escape out of that poverty.
Okay, yeah, you've raised a lot of good, sound issues. Let me address a few of them, or just amplify on a few of them. When you talk about the market forces that operate in the labor market, you mentioned that the fact is that employers are competing for workers. And, you know, the attitude of the left has always been that without a minimum wage, employers are so greedy, so self-centered, that they will pay only subsistence wages. And so if you get rid of the $7.25 mandated wage, employers are going to drive down wage rates to $1 an hour because they're so greedy and self-centered. However, we find that a lot of employers are paying more than the state mandated wages of $15 an hour. How does the left explain that? When some company is paying $20 an hour, how do they reconcile that with their little philosophy that the employers will pay the lowest wage possible? Well, it's explained by the fact of what you were saying, that in a free market, employers are bidding up the wages of workers. There's a scarcity of workers, and so they don't even think in terms of minimum wage. They think in terms of, what do I need to pay to get these workers? And that's how the wages are bid up in a free market. The minimum wage at that point becomes irrelevant because employers are placing a higher value on the work skills of these workers than the state mandated minimum. Another thing that you mentioned was the idea that people should be free to work at these sub minimum wages, because this is the first rung on the economic ladder. This is how they learn a work ethic. This is how they learn work skills. They get better at what they do. I mean, think of it. Oh, who is that, Richard?
This is Duke Ellington, our
Duke.
standard poodle.
Well,
And he
Duke,
seems very happy to see his daddy.
yeah,
And
he really
really
does.
is trying to ham in on getting on streaming on YouTube.
Oh, this is awesome. Hi, Duke. Woof.
He's a good boy. He's 2 years old. He's 2 years old, and he loves his mommy and daddy, and really is hoping that he doesn't have to work at a minimum wage to get his cookies.
Well, he's a classic example of somebody that's working for free. And that was the point I was going to bring up, that, you know, you take a lot of well-to-do white kids that work as apprentices, say in colleges or Washington, D.C., and why they work for free? Well, because they want to learn a work skill. They want to learn the particular thing that they're doing, and they're willing to do it for free for that reason. Well, the same thing works in the marketplace. That, you know, a black teenager, you mentioned that black teenage unemployment rates are significantly higher than others. He might want to work for free as an apprentice. Why? To learn the business, to learn the trade. And he gets better at it. So the following year, all of a sudden, now he's got more marketability. He's now able to demand a higher wage, maybe higher than the state mandated minimum. Or in other cases, he may want to start a business where he hires everybody in the neighborhood for $1 an hour or $2 an hour, because those kids want to do the same thing. They want to learn the trade, how to treat customers and so forth. And so by eliminating the minimum wage, you let these black teenagers or other unemployed people get on that first rung of the economic ladder, where they can then keep climbing. But when you lock them out in their most formative years of the first 4 or 5 rungs of the economic ladder, they never get the job. And so they never learn these work skills, and they're shunted over into either welfare or, more likely, the drug trade, because the government's other program, the war on drugs, makes the drug trade exorbitantly remunerative for black teenagers or others who want to make a quick score. The other aspect of this, you mentioned the racial aspect. There are people that are racially bigoted in society. There's no point in denying that. But let's assume that an employer who happens to be a bigot, let's say in the state of Alabama, is faced with hiring 2 individuals, a black and a white, at both at the state mandated minimum. Let's say it's $7.25 an hour. Who's the bigot going to hire given that choice? Well, clearly he's going to hire the white guy. But with no minimum wage, the black guy can say, wait a minute here, I'll work for $5 an hour. Well, now the bigot's faced with a choice. Does he go with his bigotry and pay more money and therefore have less profits? Or does he go with the black guy and make more money? So the lack of a minimum wage enables the black person to break down racial barriers by being able to compete on the basis of price. So people that say that, oh, the minimum wage helps blacks in the face of bigotry in America, yeah, nonsense. It's the exact opposite. And then the final point you make is so critically important. What is it that really causes wage rates to rise? And this is what America's discovered, especially after the publication of Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, and then, of course, the adoption of a free market type of economic system, with the exception of slavery, of course, but where the accumulation of capital became critically important, and people began recognizing that as firms acquired capital equipment, let's say a tractor instead of a hoe for harvesting crops, workers became more productive. And more productivity means more income for the firm, which means higher wages. It's the only way that wages can rise. The employer starts making more money, and that comes from higher productivity. Now, how do we ensure that the employer is going to share some of that money with the workers? Well, do we need to rely on his benevolence? No. It's the competitive process again. Other farms are doing the same thing. They're increasing their bounty with tractors, and they start bidding up the cost of labor. So if an employer or farmer says, well, I'm going to stick with the $5 an hour I was paying, adjoining farms are saying, well, we'll pay those workers $7 or $8, and they start shifting. They start moving over to the other farm, and that's what causes wage rates to rise, and it's what causes employers to share their bounty with their workers.
Yeah, you know, the point about that in a more race-conscious environment, if you have no minimum wage, those who are being prejudiced against in hiring can try to underbid others to try to make themselves attractive. The left often say, "Oh, that's illusionary," or whatever. But the fact is, economists such as the late Walter Williams or Thomas Sowell out at the Hoover Institution long argued, not just the same theoretical point that you are bringing out, and I was alluding to, but also the fact that historically that is the case. When before there was a minimum wage, or when the minimum wage was both in absolute and in relative terms extremely low, it was not uncommon throughout the United States to find that Black youth unemployment was less than white youth unemployment, the exact opposite of what I was giving the data about a few minutes ago. And why was that? Precisely because in the marketplace, at the end of the day, the only color that matters is the color of your money. And if someone is bigoted, as you were bringing out, and all other things held the same, would rather have a white employee working for them rather than a Black one. But the Black youth or Black person in general, or Hispanic person could say, you know what, I know you'd prefer him because of your own prejudices and bigotries, but I'll work for 50 cents less an hour. And you add together all of the extra revenues you'll be earning by hiring me 50 cents less an hour than that guy is willing to take. And suddenly now there's a cost to his prejudice and his bigotry. There is foregone revenues. There's the fact that there may be some other employer less racially conscious than him that's going to capture that worker, have more production at a more efficient and an effective level of output, be able to sell the product for less, and outcompete him, undercompete him for the consumer business. So now he has to weigh all of these costs as well as the psychological benefit of his own bigotries to decide whether that's the course of action for him. And historically, that was the case. Now, it might be replied, how unjust, how unfair that a person who is really just the same as the other guy, other than for the accident of the birth of a color of his skin, has to underbid himself to get the same job for which he's equally or even maybe more qualified. And from a wide perspective of cosmic justice, that may very well be true. But in the real world, where you have to deal with real people, would you rather that person be unemployed and unable to support himself and maybe a family than to overcome the prejudices of some in the society and make himself attractive enough to have a job, which may over time make him more skilled, more experienced, and more valuable, both either to the existing employer or to others who are less racially conscious? And I'll just make one other point about this, Jacob, if I may. And that is, when you discover that things that look different may actually be more or less the same, it's when you're dealing with all of them at the same time in one place. When you have white workers and Black workers, and you might have certain your own prejudices, but you realize that interacting with them, working with them, having your lunch breaks with them, but you know what? They're just like you. They have their ups and downs. They have their family problems. They have the situations with their kids. They have a mom or a dad who's in the hospital, and you have all the worries and this and that and the other. You realize they're just like you. And this is just an irrelevant accident of a skin pigmentation. Who cares? It's the very opportunities of the marketplace. Obviously not overnight, but over time helps to break down the barriers and for people to realize how similar they are to others who they thought were different.
Yeah, and what better way to nudge people to correct behavior, to non-racial bigotry than the marketplace? It's a much more effective system than just enacting laws, which really put the bigot like in a pressure cooker. He can't exercise his bigotry, and the pressure keeps building until there's these big eruptions. When in the marketplace, it just happens slowly and naturally. For example, a bigoted employer might return home and his spouse says, down the street, they just bought a new car. Why can't we get a new car? Well, because I don't hire Blacks, and they're hiring Blacks and they're making a lot more money than I am. Well, maybe we ought to hire Blacks and make a little bit more money here. Our kids want to go to a nicer school, or we got to start saving for their college. No, I'm going to maintain my racial bigotry. And the spouse says, maybe you ought to give up a little bit of racial bigotry so your kids can go to a better school. And then that sort of nudges the guy into better behavior. It seems to me, Richard, that's a much better way to do it than state mandated controls.
Yeah, I think that I think that, in my opinion, if you look at the history of America over the, let's say, 50 years and 75 years, it is certainly the case that the government has attempted to enact a variety of laws that are meant to be anti-discriminatory. But in my view, I believe that what has worked more than anything else for the reduction of race consciousness and racial tensions and greater complementary racial relationships is the fact that the society has remained sufficiently and significantly open and competitive so that opportunities have been there. People have overcome prejudices and bigotries through, to use a phrase, raising their consciousness to go over these attitudes of the past. And that itself, more than anything else, not the state, has helped wear down these tensions and animosities and antagonisms and cruelties that existed for so much of human history, including in the United States of the past.
Yeah, you mentioned Walter Williams. I mean, Walter Williams wrote that great book, timeless book, that I'd highly recommend every American read, The State Against Blacks.
Yes.
Where he talked about these type of controls like minimum wage laws. We talked in a previous Libertarian Angle on occupational licensure laws. Those are very discriminatory toward Black people because they don't have the money. A lot of them don't have the money, the inner city Blacks, to go to these very expensive cosmetology schools and other things like that. And so if people at the bottom of the economic ladder, Richard, were ever to realize what you and I are talking about, that these laws really are an attack on racial minorities, and they're part of the reason of keeping racial minorities now. They're sort of like the new Jim Crow, the Jim Crow of our time. We could see a really nice positive revolution in ideas and paradigm thinking and shifting in our lifetime toward economic liberty and the genuine free market.
Yeah, and if I can just make a point about this power of the market to make people who may view each other in extremely conflicting ways, with great animosities, act in harmonious ways, was already understood by the famous French philosopher Voltaire. He pointed out that he was visiting England and went to the London Stock Exchange. And here were Christians and Muslims and Jews who otherwise would be at each other's throats. And what are they doing? They're all peacefully and cooperatively trading and dealing with commercial and financial matters together. Why? Because the market creates opportunities for harmony and mutual gains from trade and prosperity that at the end of the day is more powerful as men try to improve their circumstances than the strongest, most irrational and harmful bigotries.
All right, on that eloquent note, we'll wrap things up. We're out of time. Thanks for tuning in. Again, if you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org for 34 years of great articles, videos, presentations, podcasts. You'll get the sound message on liberty when you come to FFF. And Richard, I greatly enjoyed the conversation as always, and I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.